She walked into that courtroom wearing a red dress that cost more than most people's cars, convinced the war was already won. Connor Vance wasn't just there to steal Arthur Kensington's fortune. She was there to destroy his wife Sarah for sport. She laughed on the stand. She mocked Sarah's tears. She thought the law was blind, but she forgot that Judge William Harrison had 20/20 vision for liars. It was the perfect crime until the judge asked Connor just one simple question, a question that didn't just end the trial. It ended her life as she knew it. Stay tuned, because the answer will give you chills. The rain in Seattle that morning was relentless, hammering against the tall glass windows of the King County Superior Court like 1,000 tiny gavels demanding order. Inside courtroom 4B, the air was thick, smelling of floor wax, wet wool, and the distinct metallic scent of high-stakes anxiety. On the left side of the aisle sat Sarah Kensington. At 42, she looked a decade older. Her brown hair was pulled back in a severe fraying bun, and she wore a charcoal grey suit that seemed 2 sizes too big, swallowing her shrinking frame. She sat with her hands clasped tightly in her lap, her knuckles white, staring at the grain of the mahogany table as if it held the secrets to the universe. To the casual observer, she looked defeated. She looked like a woman who had already packed her bags and accepted the loss. On the right side, the atmosphere was entirely different. It was electric. Arthur Kensington, the CEO of Kensington Logistics, sat with the posture of a man who owned the building. He checked his Rolex every 30 seconds, tapping a polished shoe against the floor, radiating impatience. He wasn't worried about losing half his fortune. He was annoyed that this formality was taking up his Tuesday morning. And then there was Connor. Connor Vance didn't sit. She posed. At 26, she was a striking vision of manufactured perfection. She wore a fitted crimson dress that was arguably inappropriate for family court. Too bright, too tight, a silent scream for attention. Her blonde hair was a cascading waterfall of salon-perfect waves. She whispered something into Arthur's ear, giggling softly, her hand lingering on his shoulder, a deliberate display of ownership right in front of the woman he had been married to for 20 years. Order. Judge William Harrison's voice boomed, cutting through the low murmur of the gallery. Judge Harrison was a man of 60, with a face carved from granite and eyes that had seen every variety of human deceit the city had to offer. He adjusted his spectacles, looking over the rim at the 3 players in this tragedy. He had read the briefs. He knew the numbers, but he was looking for something that wasn't on paper. We are here to finalize the divorce proceedings of Kensington versus Kensington, the judge said, his voice dry, and to settle the dispute regarding the assets and the petition for spousal support. Arthur's lawyer, a shark named Marcus Thorne, with a smile that didn't reach his eyes, stood up. Your Honor, my client contends that Mrs. Kensington is not entitled to the standard division of assets due to the prenup signed 20 years ago. Furthermore, we intend to prove that her recent behavior demonstrates mental instability, rendering her unfit to manage the trust fund for their minor son. Sarah flinched. It was a subtle movement, just a twitch of the shoulder, but Connor saw it. Connor covered her mouth, masking a smirk. She leaned toward Arthur, whispering loud enough for the front row to hear. Look at her. She's shaking. She knows it's over. Arthur didn't shush her. He just smirked back. Sarah's lawyer, Eleanor Sterling, was a stark contrast to Arthur's high-priced shark. She was older, wearing a sensible navy suit, moving with slow, deliberate precision. She placed a hand on Sarah's trembling arm. Steady, Sarah, she whispered. Let them preen. Peacocks are easiest to shoot. The gallery was packed. Friends of the Kensingtons, curious onlookers, and a few reporters were present. The fall of the Kensington Empire was big news. Everyone knew Arthur had left Sarah for the former swimsuit model, but the allegations Arthur was throwing around, that Sarah was crazy, that she was a hoarder, that she was dangerous, had turned the divorce into a spectacle. "Mr. Thorne, call your first witness," Judge Harrison said, leaning back. "We call Arthur Kensington to the stand." As Arthur walked to the stand, he adjusted his tie. He swore to tell the truth, a concept that seemed foreign to him. "Mr. Kensington," Thorne began pacing the floor, "why are you contesting the spousal support? Because—" Arthur said, his voice smooth, practicing the baritone he used in boardrooms. "Sarah has changed. Over the last 5 years, she has ceased to be a partner. She refuses to attend social functions. She spends days in bed. She has become a burden on my career and my mental health. And frankly, the prenup stated that infidelity would void the agreement. And while I admit to my relationship with Miss Vance, it only began after Sarah had effectively abandoned the marriage emotionally. It was a lie, a bold, flat-faced lie." Sarah looked up, her eyes watery. She remembered the lipstick on his collar 3 years ago. She remembered the late-night texts. "And Miss Vance?" Thorne asked, teeing him up. "Connor saved me," Arthur said, looking lovingly at his mistress. "She brought life back into my home. She organizes my schedule. She supports my business. She is everything a wife should be." Connor beamed from the bench, offering a small theatrical wave to the jury box, even though there was no jury. Judge Harrison scribbled something on his notepad. He didn't look impressed. He looked bored, but his eyes flicked briefly to Sarah, noting her silence. "Your witness," Thorne said, looking at Eleanor Sterling with disdain. Eleanor stood up. She didn't walk to the podium. She stood by her desk. "No questions for Mr. Kensington at this time, Your Honor." A ripple of shock went through the room. Even Arthur looked confused. He had prepared for a fight. He had prepared to list all of Sarah's crazy episodes. But Sarah's lawyer was letting him go. Connor leaned over to Arthur as he returned to his seat. "She's incompetent," Connor hissed, delighted. "They're giving up. We're going to get the house in the Hamptons, too." "Next witness," the judge said. Thorne smiled. This was the kill shot. "We call Connor Vance to the stand." The courtroom shifted. This was the moment everyone was waiting for. The other woman was about to testify against the wife. It was unorthodox, cruel, and exactly what Arthur wanted. He wanted to humiliate Sarah. Connor stood up. The fabric of her red dress stretched as she walked to the stand, the click-clack of her designer heels echoing like gunshots. She sat down, crossed her legs, and tossed her hair back. She didn't look at the lawyer. She looked directly at Sarah. And she smiled. A cold, predatorial smile. The mockery was about to begin. "Miss Vance?" Thorne began, his voice soft, almost gentle. "Please state your relationship to Mr. Kensington." "I am his fiancée," Connor said, her voice a practiced melodic purr. "And his business partner." "Business partner?" Thorne asked, feigning surprise. "Yes. I help manage the Kensington Charitable Foundation and several of his offshore logistical coordination efforts. Arthur needs someone sharp by his side. The business world is fast-paced." She paused, her eyes flickering to Sarah. "It's not a place for fragile people." "You've spent considerable time in the Kensington household recently, haven't you?" "I have. I moved in 6 months ago, after Arthur asked Sarah to leave." "And what did you observe about Mrs. Kensington during the transition?" Connor laughed. It was a light tinkling sound, but it carried a razor blade inside it. "Oh, it was sad, really. The house was a wreck. Not dirty, but depressing. Heavy curtains always drawn. And Sarah, she would just wander the halls in her bathrobe. Sometimes she wouldn't shower for days. She looked like a ghost. Sarah stared at her hands. She remembered those days. She wasn't wandering. She was grieving the death of her mother and the realization that her husband was sleeping with his secretary. She wasn't dirty. She was depressed. But Connor was twisting it into madness. "Did she ever speak to you?" Thorne asked. Once, Connor said, leaning into the microphone, relishing the attention. "She told me I would never be happy, that I was a temporary distraction. It was pathetic, honestly. She was screaming, throwing throw pillows. I actually feared for my safety. That's why Arthur had to install the new security system." Judge Harrison looked up from his notes. "She threw pillows at you?" "Yes, Your Honor," Connor said, widening her eyes to look innocent. "Velvet ones. They can be quite heavy." A few people in the gallery chuckled. The judge did not. "And how did you handle this aggression?" Thorne continued. "With grace," Connor said smoothly. "I tried to help her. I offered to help her pack. I even offered to buy her some new clothes, things that fit. She's let herself go so terribly. A woman has a duty to keep herself up for her husband. Don't you think it's no wonder Arthur looked elsewhere? Who would want to come home to a funeral every day?" This was the dagger, the direct insult to Sarah's appearance and womanhood. Sarah's lawyer, Eleanor, scribbled furiously on her pad. Sarah finally looked up. Her eyes weren't watery anymore. They were hard. "Miss Vance," Thorne said, concluding his questioning, "do you believe Sarah Kensington is fit to manage the complexities of the Kensington estate?" "Absolutely not," Connor scoffed. "She can barely manage a grocery list. Arthur handles all the finances. Sarah doesn't even know how to log in to the bank accounts. She's simple. She's a relic. Arthur needs a partner who understands the modern world, who understands value." "Thank you, Miss Vance." Thorne sat down, looking smug. He had successfully painted Sarah as a bitter, unhinged frump, and Connor as the capable modern savior. "Cross-examination?" Judge Harrison asked. Eleanor Sterling stood up slowly. She buttoned her jacket. She walked toward the witness stand, not with aggression, but with a strange, calm curiosity. She held a single piece of paper in her hand. "Miss Vance," Eleanor began, her voice raspy but clear. "You mentioned you are Mr. Kensington's business partner. Is that correct?" "Yes," Connor said, lifting her chin. "I am." "And you specifically mentioned managing offshore logistical coordination efforts. That sounds very impressive." "It is," Connor said, checking her nails. "I handle the difficult clients." "I see," Eleanor said. She walked closer. "And because of this vital role you play, Arthur has compensated. You hasn't he, gift salary? Arthur is generous." Connor smiled. "He appreciates talent." "Indeed." Eleanor glanced at Arthur, who was frowning slightly. "Now, Miss Vance, you also mocked my client's appearance. You said she let herself go. You pride yourself on your appearance, don't you? I take care of myself. It's called self-respect. And the dress you are wearing today, it is a Valentino, isn't it?" Connor's eyes lit up. She loved talking about fashion. "Yes, from the spring collection. It cost $4,000. "Beautiful," Eleanor said. "And the earrings diamond. 3 carats, a gift from Arthur for our 1-year anniversary." 1 year. Eleanor raised an eyebrow. "But Mr. Kensington just testified that your relationship only began 6 months ago after the separation." The courtroom went silent. Connor froze. Her eyes darted to Arthur. Arthur's face went pale. I meant," Connor stammered. We knew each other as friends. The gift was retroactive for being such a good friend." A retroactive 3-carat diamond for friendship, Eleanor repeated flatly. Interesting. Arthur stood up halfway. Objection relevance. Sit down, Mr. Kensington, Judge Harrison snapped. Overruled. Continue, Counselor. Eleanor didn't smile. She just took a step closer. The trap was being laid, but Connor was too arrogant to see the depths of it yet. She thought she had just made a minor slip-up about the timeline. She didn't realize that Eleanor wasn't chasing the infidelity. Eleanor was chasing something much, much darker. Miss Vance, Eleanor said, changing her tone to something sharper. You testified that Sarah is simple and doesn't understand finances, that she doesn't know how to log into the bank accounts. She doesn't, Connor sneered, recovering her composure. She's clueless. And you are the smart one, the capable one. I have a degree in marketing. I know how money works. Good, Eleanor said. She turned back to her table and picked up a thick binder. Because I have some questions about how money works regarding a company called Vance Global Solutions. Connor's face, previously flushed with arrogance, suddenly drained of all color. It was as if someone had pulled a plug. Arthur Kensington stopped tapping his foot. He went perfectly still. Vance Global Solutions, Eleanor read from the file. Incorporated in the Cayman Islands 8 months ago. Sole proprietor, Connor Vance. Connor stuttered. Is this the company through which you perform your logistical coordination? Eleanor asked. Connor looked at Arthur. Arthur was staring at the judge, refusing to meet her eyes. He was cutting her loose. She could feel it. Yes, Connor whispered. That's my company. And can you explain to the court, Eleanor asked, her voice raising just a decibel, why Vance Global Solutions received a transfer of $2 million from the Kensington Joint Family Trust, the trust designated for the minor son 3 days before Arthur filed for divorce. The gallery gasped. This wasn't just adultery anymore. This was embezzlement. I didn't. Connor looked around wildly. Arthur told me to. He said it was for tax purposes. He said it was his money. So you admit to receiving the funds? It was a loan, a business loan. Connor shouted, her poise shattering. Arthur set it up. I just signed the papers. So you signed papers without knowing what they were. I thought you were the smart one, the business partner. Eleanor's voice was like a whip. I do know I run that company. Connor yelled, desperate to regain her status, falling right into the trap. I make the decisions. You make the decisions, Eleanor asked, pausing. So you decided to take $2 million from a child's trust fund. No, Arthur did it. Connor screamed, standing up in the witness box. He told me Sarah was too stupid to notice. He said we could hide the assets in my name until the divorce was over, and then move them back. The silence that followed was absolute. Connor clapped a hand over her mouth. She had just admitted to conspiracy to commit fraud, money laundering, and hiding assets during a divorce proceeding. She had just confessed on the record. Arthur buried his face in his hands, but Judge Harrison wasn't done. He hadn't spoken yet. He was just watching. He cleared his throat. Miss Vance, the judge said. His voice was terrifyingly calm. Connor looked at him, tears streaming down her face, ruining her perfect makeup. Yes, Your Honor. This was it. The moment. Judge Harrison took off his glasses. You claim to run this company. You claim to be a business partner. You just admitted to moving the funds. He leaned forward. But here is the one question I need you to answer, and I remind you that perjury carries a prison sentence of up to 5 years. The judge held up a single document. The silence in courtroom 4B was no longer just quiet. It was heavy. It pressed down on everyone's chest. Outside, the Seattle rain had turned into a storm thunder, rumbling in the distance like a warning shot. Judge Harrison held the document in the air. It was a single sheet of paper, innocuous to the naked eye, but to those who understood the language of finance, it was a death warrant. Connor Vance stood in the witness box, her chest heaving. She was still riding the adrenaline of her outburst, the defiant scream that she, and only she, ran the company. She thought she was fighting for ownership of $2 million. She thought she was proving her dominance over the simple housewife sitting at the plaintiff's table. She didn't realize she had just walked into a room full of gas and lit a match. "Miss Vance," Judge Harrison said, his voice dropping to a register that vibrated through the floorboards. "You have stated under oath, and quite passionately, I might add, that you are the sole proprietor of Vance Global Solutions, that you make the decisions, that you signed the papers." "Yes," Connor said, her voice trembling slightly now. She looked at Arthur for reassurance, but Arthur was staring at the table, his face the color of ash. He wasn't looking at her. He was looking at the exit. "It's my company. I built it." "You built it," the judge repeated. A grim smile touched his lips. "And as the owner, you are fully aware of the company's assets." "Of course." "And its liabilities." Connor blinked. "Liabilities, debts, Miss Vance, obligations." Judge Harrison lowered the paper and peered over his spectacles. "This document I am holding is a lien notification from the Banque Privée in Zurich. It seems that Vance Global Solutions was not just a repository for the $2 million transferred from the Kensington Trust. It was also used as the primary guarantor for a leveraged buyout of a failing shipping consortium in Malaysia 3 months ago." Connor frowned. I don't know about Malaysia." "That is strange," the judge said, "considering you make all the decisions, because according to this Vance Global Solutions, and by extension, its sole proprietor, is currently liable for the defaulted loans of that transaction." The judge leaned forward, and then he asked the question, the one question that shattered the world Connor thought she lived in. "Miss Vance, are you aware that by claiming sole ownership of this company to this court, you have just accepted personal liability for a corporate debt totaling $14 million? The number hung in the air. $14 million. Connor's mouth opened, but no sound came out. She looked like a fish pulled onto a dock. She looked at Arthur. "Arthur," she whispered, "what is he talking about?" Arthur Kensington didn't move. He didn't speak. He remained frozen, a statue of guilt. "The $2 million you stole from the trust," the judge continued, his voice relentless, "was merely the collateral used to secure a much larger high-risk loan. Mr. Kensington knew the shipping deal was toxic. He knew it would collapse. He needed a place to dump the debt, so it wouldn't touch his personal portfolio or the Kensington main accounts." The judge looked at Connor with something akin to pity. "He didn't set up that company to make you rich, Miss Vance. He set it up to make you the fall guy. He put the assets in your name, yes, but he attached a bomb to them. And you just told this court on record that you are the one holding the detonator." Connor turned slowly to face Arthur. The love, the adoration, the smug superiority she had worn minutes ago dissolved into pure, unadulterated horror. "You," she choked out. "You told me it was a tax haven." Arthur finally looked up. His eyes were cold, dead things. "It was business, Connor. You wanted to be a partner. That's the cost of doing business." "You set me up," Connor shrieked. The sound was primal. "You set me up to go to jail. You set me up to be bankrupt." "Order." Judge Harrison banged his gavel, but the dam had broken. Connor Vance, the woman who had walked in like a queen, suddenly lunged over the railing of the witness box. She wasn't reaching for the judge. She was reaching for Arthur. "I'll kill you." She screamed, her red dress tearing as she scrambled toward the defense table. "I'll tell them everything. I'll tell them about the bribes. I'll tell them about the inspector." 2 bailiffs moved in, instantly restraining her. She kicked and screamed, her mascara running in black streaks down her face, transforming her into a grotesque mask of tragedy. "Get her out of here," Judge Harrison ordered, though he looked unbothered. "And take her into custody. Perjury is the least of her problems now. I imagine the federal prosecutors will want to speak with the owner of Vance Global Solutions immediately." As they dragged Connor out, she was no longer the mistress who mocked the wife. She was a weapon that had backfired. She screamed back at the table, "Look at him, he's the crook, he made me do it." But the doors slammed shut, cutting off her wails. The courtroom fell into a stunned silence. Arthur Kensington sat alone at his table. He adjusted his tie, trying to regain his composure. He stood up, clearing his throat. "Your Honor," Arthur said, his voice shaky but attempting confidence. "Clearly Miss Vance is unstable. I had no idea she was involved in such risky overseas investments. I am as shocked as you are. I am a victim here as well." It was a masterclass in gaslighting. He was cutting Connor loose to save himself. He figured with Connor gone and discredited, he could simply claim ignorance and walk away with a slap on the wrist. He thought he had survived. He turned to look at Sarah. He expected to see her cowering. He expected to see her confused. Instead, Sarah Kensington was smiling. It wasn't a happy smile. It was the smile of a grandmaster who had just watched her opponent move his queen into a trap she had set 20 moves ago. "Mr. Thorne," Judge Harrison said, turning to Arthur's lawyer. "Do you have any further witnesses?" Thorne looked at his client, then at the door where Connor had been dragged out. He looked sick. "No, Your Honor. The defense rests." "Very well," the judge said. "Ms. Sterling, call your next witness." Eleanor Sterling stood up. She didn't look at the judge. She looked at Arthur. "We call Sarah Kensington to the stand." Sarah stood up. As she moved toward the witness stand, something changed. The hunch in her shoulders vanished. The shuffling gait was replaced by a smooth, confident stride. She didn't look frail anymore. As she sat in the chair, she took a moment to smooth her skirt, and when she looked up, her eyes were clear, sharp, and terrifyingly intelligent. "Mrs. Kensington," Eleanor Sterling said, "you have heard the testimony today. You have heard your husband describe you as simple, mentally unstable, and incapable of managing finances. Would you like to address those claims?" "I would," Sarah said. Her voice was different, too. Gone was the whisper. In its place was an articulate, calm contralto. Arthur prefers to see what he wants to see. He wanted a silent wife, so I became silent. He wanted a foolish wife, so I played the fool. "Why?" Eleanor asked. "Because," Sarah said, locking eyes with Arthur. "You don't interrupt your enemy when he is making a mistake." Arthur stiffened. "Mrs. Kensington," Eleanor continued, "can you tell the court about your educational background? It was omitted from the pre-trial briefs filed by your husband." "Certainly. I hold a master's degree in forensic accounting from the Wharton School of Business. Before I married Arthur, I was a senior auditor for the IRS, specializing in corporate fraud and shell company deconstruction." A gasp went through the gallery. The reporters in the back row started typing furiously. Arthur's mouth fell open. He had met Sarah at a gala 20 years ago. She had already retired to raise a family. He had never asked about her work. He assumed she was a secretary or a teacher. He never asked, because he never cared. "Forensic accounting," Eleanor repeated. "So you understand how shell companies work." "Better than my husband does, evidently," Sarah said dryly. Let's talk about the last 2 years, Eleanor said. You stopped attending galas. You wore old clothes. You let the house go. Why? It's a psychological technique called grey rocking, Sarah explained to the juryless room. When you are dealing with a narcissist, someone who feeds on drama, who needs to feel superior, the only way to gain the upper hand is to become a grey rock. Boring, unnoticeable, unthreatening. If I had fought him, if I had shown my intelligence, he would have hidden his tracks better. He would have been cautious. But because he thought I was a depressed, clueless housewife, he got sloppy. He stopped hiding his phone. He left documents on the desk. He underestimated me, and arrogance is the father of all errors. Arthur was gripping the edge of the table so hard his knuckles were purple. And when did you discover the affair with Miss Vance? 2 years ago, August 14th, Sarah recited. I found a receipt for a diamond bracelet in his jacket pocket. It was purchased with funds from our joint savings. And you didn't confront him? No, because divorce isn't about anger, Ms. Sterling. It's about leverage. If I had confronted him, then I would have gotten half of what he claimed he had. But I knew Arthur. I knew he was hiding assets. I needed time to find them. So I let him have his affair. I let him bring her into my home. I let her mock me. Because every time she mocked me, she felt safer. And every time she felt safer, she signed another document without reading it. Sarah turned to the judge. I didn't just watch them steal the money, Your Honor. I traced it. Traced it? Judge Harrison asked, fascinated. Yes, Arthur believes he is a financial genius because he inherited a logistics company, but he uses a predictable algorithm for his passwords and routing obfuscation. It took me about 3 weeks to gain mirror access to his private cloud server. You hacked him, Thorne Arthur's lawyer shouted. Objection, illegal search. Not hacked, Sarah corrected calmly. He used our son's birthday as the password, and the server was registered to the home IP address, which is in my name. I simply logged in. Overruled, the judge said, barely hiding a smirk. And what did you find on this server, Mrs. Kensington? Eleanor asked. Everything, Sarah said. The dual set of books for Kensington Logistics, the bribes paid to customs officials in 3 different countries, the plans to defraud the shareholders, and of course the communications setting up Vance Global Solutions as a debt dump. She paused, taking a sip of water. But I found something else. Something Arthur doesn't know I know. Arthur was sweating now, profusely. He stood up. Sarah, don't. We can settle right now. Half I'll give you, half. Sit down, Mr. Kensington. The bailiff barked. No, Sarah said softly. I don't want half, Arthur. I want the truth. She looked at her lawyer. Please play Exhibit C. Eleanor Sterling nodded to the court clerk, who pressed a button on the AV console. A large screen descended from the ceiling. The courtroom speakers crackled, and then Arthur's voice filled the room. It was crystal clear. She's a cow, Connor. A useless grazing cow. I can't stand looking at her. The gallery murmured. It was cruel, but not illegal. Then came Connor's voice. So leave her already. What are we waiting for? Arthur's voice. I can't just leave. The prenup protects the original assets. If I leave, I lose the liquid capital. I need to move the liquidity out first. We'll drain the trust to maximize the loans against the company and dump it all into the offshore accounts. Then I'll file for divorce on the grounds of her mental incompetency. If she's declared incompetent, I get power of attorney over her share. We get everything. Connor, and the boy. What about your son? There was a pause on the recording, a chilling silence. Arthur. He's like his mother, weak. We'll send him to boarding school in Switzerland. I don't care what happens to him, as long as the trust fund is cleared out, before he turns 18. The audio cut off. The silence in the courtroom was different now. It wasn't heavy. It was sharp. It felt like violence. Sarah sat on the stand, her face stoic, but a single tear traced a path down her cheek. She wasn't crying for her marriage. She was crying for her son, a father who would bankrupt his own child just to live a life of luxury with a mistress. Judge Harrison's face had gone dark. He slowly turned his head toward Arthur. The look in his eyes was enough to wither a lesser man. "Mr. Kensington," the judge said quietly, "did you just hear that recording?" Arthur was shaking. He whispered something to his lawyer, but Marcus Thorne was inching his chair away from Arthur, creating physical distance. Thorne knew when a ship was sinking, and this wasn't just sinking. It was imploding. It's doctored," Arthur stammered. "Deep fake. AI. It's not real." "We have the metadata," Sarah said from the stand. "Time-stamped geolocated from your phone, which automatically backed up to the cloud. The cloud I had access to. It's real, Arthur, and so are the wire transfers." Sarah pulled a folder from her bag. She didn't hand it to her lawyer. She held it up. "I didn't just watch the money go, Arthur. I redirected it." Arthur froze. "What? You tried to move $12 million to an account in the Cayman Islands last Tuesday," Sarah said. "You thought you were sending it to Kensington Holdings offshore, but you didn't check the routing number effectively. You assumed the saved template was correct." I sent it," Arthur said. "I saw the confirmation." "You saw a confirmation?" Sarah corrected. "But 3 months ago, while you were busy in Cabo with Connor, I updated the routing protocols in your home office. You didn't send that money to the Caymans, Arthur." She smiled, and for the first time, it was a smile of pure victory. "You sent it to the Seattle Children's Hospital Charity Fund." The room erupted. "No!" Arthur roared, slamming his fist on the table. "That's my money. You gave away my money." "Technically," Sarah said, her voice cutting through the noise, "it was the proceeds of criminal activity, which you were attempting to launder. I merely donated it on your behalf. It's a tax write-off, Arthur. You should be thanking me." Arthur lunged. He never made it 3 steps. The bailiff, who had been waiting for this moment since the recording played, tackled Arthur Kensington to the floor. The CEO of Kensington Logistics, the man who thought he was untouchable, was pinned to the cheap carpet, his face pressed against the dust, handcuffed in front of the people he tried to impress. "Get off me, do you know who I am?" Arthur screamed. "Yes," Judge Harrison said from the bench, standing up. "You are a man who is about to have a very long conversation with the district attorney." The judge looked down at Sarah. "Mrs. Kensington, step down. You've done enough." Sarah stood up. She walked back to her table, not looking at Arthur, as he was hauled up, panting and red-faced. She sat down and poured herself a glass of water. Her hand was steady. The trial was technically over, but the justice was just beginning. Judge Harrison waited for the bailiffs to secure Arthur back in his chair. The judge picked up his gavel. He didn't bang it yet. He looked at Arthur, then at the empty seat where Connor had been, and finally at Sarah. "In 30 years on the bench," Judge Harrison said, "I have seen greed. I have seen betrayal. But I have never seen such a calculated attempt to destroy a family from the inside out." He turned to the court stenographer. "Let the record show that the prenuptial agreement is hereby declared null and void due to the demonstrated fraudulent intent of the petitioner." Arthur slumped in his chair. "Furthermore," the judge continued, I am issuing an immediate freezing order on all remaining assets of Mr. Kensington, pending a federal investigation into the fraud and embezzlement revealed by Mrs. Kensington's testimony. Mr. Kensington, you are remanded into custody until a bail hearing can be set. And given the flight risk you clearly pose, I suggest you don't get your hopes up. The judge turned to Sarah. Mrs. Kensington, regarding the petition for spousal support. Sarah stood up. Your Honor. I don't think you need spousal support, the judge said, a twinkle in his eye. I think you need a CEO position. I intend to take over the company, Your Honor, Sarah said, once the corruption is purged, for my son. Granted, the judge said. Judgment for the respondent. Full custody of the minor child to Sarah Kensington. Full transfer of the marital home and all liquid assets remaining to Sarah Kensington. He raised the gavel. And Mr. Kensington? Arthur looked up, broken. You mentioned earlier that your wife was a burden on your mental health, the judge said. I hope you find the solitude of a federal prison cell less burdensome. Bang! The sound of the gavel marked the end of the Kensington Empire and the rise of Sarah. The transition from the mahogany warmth of courtroom 4B to the sterile fluorescent cold of the King County Correctional Processing Center was a shock that Arthur Kensington could not process. 3 hours ago he had been checking his Rolex, annoyed that he might miss a lunch reservation at Canlis. Now his Rolex was in a plastic bag marked Evidence. His bespoke Italian suit had been exchanged for a coarse orange jumpsuit that smelled of industrial detergent and other men's sweat, and he was sitting on a metal bench bolted to the floor. He wasn't alone. In the holding cell across the hall, separated by reinforced glass and a corridor of despair, was Connor Vance. Connor was unrecognizable. The tears had dried into black crusts on her cheeks. Her hair, once a perfect cascade, was matted. The red dress, the symbol of her victory, the dress she wore to mock Sarah, was now wrinkled and stained. She sat with her knees pulled to her chest, rocking back and forth. When she saw Arthur through the glass, she didn't scream. She didn't bang on the walls. She just stared. It was a look of pure, distilled hatred. She had realized in the silence of her cell that she was never the queen. She was never the partner. She was the getaway car, and Arthur had crashed her into a wall to save himself. The legal fallout was swift and brutal, because Sarah had provided the metadata and the routing numbers the district attorney didn't have to go digging. The map was already drawn. Within 48 hours, the FBI raided the offices of Kensington Logistics. They found the dual servers Sarah had described. They found the Vance Global binders. Arthur's lawyer, Marcus Thorne, recused himself from the case the next morning. He issued a brief statement, citing irreconcilable ethical conflicts, which in lawyer speak meant, my client is guilty broke, and I'm not going down with him. Arthur was left with a public defender, a tired man named Greg, who looked at the mountain of evidence and told Arthur the only advice that mattered: plead guilty. Beg for mercy. But narcissists do not beg. Arthur Kensington fought. He spent the last dregs of his hidden cash reserves hiring a new defense team. He dragged the process out for 6 months. He tried to claim Sarah had entrapped him. He tried to claim the audio recording was a deepfake, even after 3 independent experts verified it. He tried to claim Connor was the mastermind, a black widow, who seduced him into crime. It didn't work. The trial of the people versus Arthur Kensington became the media sensation of the year. The red dress mistress and the grey rock wife were headlines in every tabloid. But the courtroom was no longer Arthur's stage. It was his slaughterhouse. Connor Vance, facing 15 years for fraud and money laundering, took a plea deal. She turned state's witness. On a rainy Tuesday, exactly 6 months after the divorce hearing, Connor took the stand again. This time she wore a simple grey sweater. She looked older, broken. He told me he loved me. Connor told the jury, her voice devoid of the melodic purr she had used before. He told me Sarah was the enemy. He told me that if I signed the papers we would live in Paris. He used me. He used my name because he knew if the company went under, I would be the one liable. She looked at Arthur, who was glaring at her from the defense table. He called Sarah simple. Connor said, a dry laugh escaping her. But he was the simple one. He thought he could buy people. He thought loyalty was a transaction. He didn't know that when the check bounces, the loyalty ends. The jury deliberated for less than 2 hours. Guilty. On all counts. Wire fraud. Embezzlement. Conspiracy to commit money laundering. Tax evasion. Arthur Kensington stood as the verdict was read. He didn't cry. He didn't shout. He just blinked a tick developing under his left eye. His reality had fractured. He couldn't understand how the world had stopped obeying him. Judge Harrison, who had presided over the criminal trial as well, offered no leniency. "Mr. Kensington," the judge said, looking down from the bench. "You lived a life of extraordinary privilege. You had a faithful wife, a healthy son, and a thriving business. You chose to burn it all for greed and ego. You treated people like assets to be liquidated. Today, society is liquidating you." The sentence: 25 years in federal prison. No possibility of parole for 20 years. Connor Vance was sentenced to 4 years in a minimum security facility thanks to her cooperation. As she was led away, she didn't look back at Arthur. She looked for Sarah in the gallery. But Sarah wasn't there. Sarah hadn't come to the criminal trial. She was too busy living. The camera flash was blinding, a stark white burst against the rainy backdrop of the Seattle skyline. "Miss Kensington, if you could just tilt your chin up slightly." "Perfect. That's the shot. That's the look of the comeback." Sarah Kensington sat in a plush armchair in the corner of her office, posing for the cover of Forbes magazine. The headline had already been drafted, "From Silence to Solvency, How Sarah Kensington Saved an Empire." A year ago, Sarah would have flinched at the camera. She would have tried to shrink into the upholstery, terrified that a photo might reveal her wrinkles, her sadness, or the fear that Arthur had instilled in her for 2 decades. But today, Sarah didn't shrink. She leaned forward. She wore a tailored cream blazer that cost more than the entire wardrobe she had worn during her marriage, and her hair, once a fraying bun, was now a sharp architectural bob that framed a face defined by intelligence and grit. "We're done," the photographer said, lowering his lens. "Thank you, Miss Kensington. You're a natural." "I had to learn to be," Sarah said, standing up. Survival turns out to be a very photogenic quality. As the camera crew packed up, Sarah walked to the floor-to-ceiling windows. The office behind her was unrecognizable from the dark, oppressive cave Arthur had ruled from. The heavy mahogany paneling, which had always smelled of stale cigars and fear, had been stripped away. The walls were now glass and brushed steel. The heavy velvet curtains were gone, replaced by light, airy blinds that let the grey Seattle light flood the room. Arthur had built this office to intimidate people. Sarah had renovated it to welcome them. Her assistant, a bright young man named David, whom Arthur had previously relegated to the mailroom because he didn't have the look, knocked on the open glass door. "Sarah, the board is waiting in conference room A. They're nervous about the quarterly projections." Sarah smiled, picking up her tablet. "Let them be nervous, David. Nervousness keeps us sharp." Arthur was never nervous, and look where that got him. She walked into the conference room, the click of her heels sounding not like gunshots as Connor's had, but like a metronome, steady and reliable. The board of directors, a collection of older men who had initially panicked when Arthur was arrested, fell silent as she entered. A year ago, they had whispered that she was a housewife. They had whispered that the company was dead in the water. They didn't know that the housewife had spent her evenings deconstructing Arthur's fraudulent ledgers. "Gentlemen," Sarah said, taking her seat at the head of the table. She didn't sit in Arthur's massive leather throne. She had replaced it with an ergonomic mesh chair, same as everyone else's. "I've reviewed the anxieties regarding the Asian logistics arm. You're worried about the debt restructuring." "It's a significant liability, Sarah," one of the directors said. "Arthur left a mess. The shell companies, the bribes, the fines alone are crippling us." "The fines are paid," Sarah corrected, sliding a digital report onto the main screen. "I liquidated the Hamptons estate and the private jet last week. That capital combined with the recovered funds from the Vance global seizure has balanced the books." She stood up and walked to the whiteboard. She uncapped a marker, red the color Arthur hated, because it meant loss. But Sarah loved it, because it meant truth. "Arthur ran this company like a Ponzi scheme, moving money to hide losses. We are running it like a logistics firm. I've implemented the new forensic tracking software I designed. We cut the bloat. We stopped the bribes. And the result?" She circled a number on the screen. "For the first time in 7 years, Kensington Logistics is posting a legitimate, clean profit of 12%. The room was silent for a heartbeat, and then the applause started. It wasn't polite applause. It was relieved, genuine applause. Sarah Kensington hadn't just saved their investments. She had saved their reputations. But the victory in the boardroom was the easy part. The numbers made sense to Sarah. Logic was clean. It was the other part of her life, the human part, that had required the real work. Later that evening, the rain had turned into a soft drizzle. Sarah's driver, a luxury she kept only for safety, pulled up to the house. It wasn't the Kensington mansion. Sarah had sold that mausoleum 6 months ago. She couldn't live in the halls where Connor had mocked her, where Arthur had ignored her. She had bought a modern open-concept home on the water in Mercer Island. It was smaller, brighter, and most importantly, it was hers. She walked inside, kicking off her heels. The house smelled of garlic-roasted tomatoes and basil. "Leo!" she called out. In the kitchen, Mum. Sarah walked in to find her 15-year-old son standing over the stove, stirring a pot of pasta sauce. A year ago, Leo had been a ghost. He was pale, silent, and terrified of making noise. Arthur had constantly threatened to send him to a boarding school in Switzerland because he was too soft. Arthur had wanted a football player. He got a sensitive artist, and he hated Leo for it. Now Leo was humming. He was wearing a messy apron. He looked up, and his face was bright. "I tried that recipe you sent me," Leo said, grinning. "I think I put too much garlic in, though." "There is no such thing as too much garlic," Sarah said, walking over and kissing him on the forehead. She grabbed a piece of bread and dipped it in the sauce. "Perfect." They ate dinner on the patio, watching the rain hit the lake. It was a simple moment, but for Sarah, it was a miracle. "I got a letter today," Leo said, quietly putting his fork down. Sarah froze. The air temperature seemed to drop. "From him," Leo nodded. "From Dad. From the prison." Sarah took a sip of her wine, her hand steady. "Did you read it?" "Yeah," Leo said. He looked at his mother, searching for a reaction. He said he's being transferred to a medium security unit in Colorado. He said the food is terrible. He said he forgives us. Sarah laughed. It was a sharp, sudden sound. "He forgives us!" "Yeah." Leo shook his head, a wry smile touching his lips. "He says if we just write a letter to the judge explaining that we misunderstood his intentions, He might get an appeal. He still thinks he's the victim mum. He thinks this is all just a big mistake. Sarah looked out at the dark water. Narcissism was a disease that didn't allow for a cure because the patient refused to admit they were sick. Arthur was sitting in a concrete box, stripped of his wealth, his reputation and his freedom, and he still believed he was the benevolent king who had been wronged by his ungrateful subjects. "How do you feel about that?" Sarah asked her son. Leo shrugged. "I feel nothing. I used to be so scared of him. I used to think he was a giant. But reading that letter, he just sounds like a small, sad man yelling at a wall." "He is," Sarah whispered. "He's a small man who cast a long shadow. But the sun is up now, Leo. The shadow is gone." "I burned it," Leo said. "The letter? Yeah, in the fireplace. I didn't want his handwriting in our house." Sarah reached across the table and squeezed her son's hand. "Good. We don't have room for ghosts here." Later that night, after Leo had gone to bed, Sarah sat in her study. On her desk sat a single sealed envelope. It wasn't from Arthur. It was from Connor Vance. It had arrived a week ago from the correctional facility where Connor was serving her 4-year sentence. Sarah hadn't opened it. She picked it up now, feeling the cheap text